Good evening. With Super Tuesday just ahead, with polls and prognostications lighting up our screens, it's easy to start thinking about the presidential primaries as a game. But of course, they are not. Who wins can make a difference in our lives and our children's lives too. Tonight, we delve into two examples where a president's priorities matter: urban policy and global warming. We will ask, what has the president done for the cities, and what would his challengers do? And the same for climate change. What's been done? What would a change of administrations mean? After that serious talk, we will lighten up and think about an actual game, Dungeons and Dragons. You would think D&D would be history in this era of obsessions like World of Warcraft, but no, it is still around, and fans are helping design the latest version themselves with online crowdsourcing. However, games come later. We begin with President Obama's urban policy. The president is the first we have had in decades who actually comes from a city. While campaigning, he often mentioned the importance of cities to the country's well-being. Once in office, he created the first ever White House Office of Urban Affairs. But then the economic crisis and the battle over health care reform changed the focus. So what has the administration achieved, and what has been pushed aside? New York Observer real estate editor Matt Chaban wrote an article for that paper called "Obama to Cities, Drop Dead: The Life and Death of a Great American Urban Policy." He is here now along with one of his sources for that article, Julia Vitullo-Martin, director of the Center for Urban Innovation at the Regional Plan Association. Welcome to both of you. And I guess people have to know that now ancient daily news headline to get the reference in your title. It was Ford to City, Drop Dead, during the New York City fiscal crisis of the 1970s. Why did you revive it for President Obama of all people?
Well, it was sort of irresistible, and perhaps in the same way that I believe the Times reported a few years ago, Ford never said that. So obviously the president hasn't come out against cities, but the idea behind the article was that there was a lot of promise behind this presidency, and as you said, you know, what an urban president, people have said the first since FDR, if not the first since TR, you know, to really come from and be for the cities. You know, there were hopes he out on the campaign trail, you know, in announcing the creation of the Office for Urban Affairs and appointing New York's own Sean Donovan to be the director of HUD. He said, we're going to put the UD, the urban development, back into HUD. And that really seemed to be a marquee issue for him. And if you talk to a lot of planners, they feel like there hasn't perhaps been as much follow through as they'd hoped.
And he did create an urban development czar. I guess they use the word czar for these kinds of positions in Washington. And it's New York's own former Bronx Borough president, Adolfo Carrion. What's he been doing? I don't see his name in the Washington Post very much.
Well, Carrion left, right? And he's now our regional secretary at HUD, although I think he just left as well. Yeah. Maybe I can go back to something Matt said. The president promised to put UD back in HUD, but he didn't promise to put the old categorical programs back in HUD. So the traditional democratic categoricals, urban renewal, model cities, public housing, these programs that were at the very essence of the Democratic Party's concept of their urban policy, which they saw as...
These were the ways to fight poverty.
These were the ways to fight
Great
poverty.
Society years, and with public housing even before.
That's right. Public housing back to the 1930s. That's right. And President Obama never promised to put those back in HUD. And I think that's really at the core of...
Why? Is that some kind of new democratic vision as opposed to an old democratic vision?
Well, it's definitely an old democratic vision, and I think President Obama represents quite a breakaway democratic vision. He is indeed our most urban president ever, but he is not a man he's not an urban dweller or thinker who believes that cities are supposed to be fundamentally poor. So he comes from, his fundamental work was in the city of Chicago on the South Side, and you may remember that a few years ago when he made the comment about walking the mean streets of Chicago, various conservatives made fun of this as if this were a preposterous thing to say, when in fact he worked in extraordinarily dangerous and difficult neighborhoods in Chicago, and he in part blamed the old categoricals for the state of these neighborhoods.
But if I get the gist of your article correctly, and see what he's doing correctly, he almost adopts the Newt Gingrich distinction, if we go to the Republican debates, of the trampoline as opposed to the safety net for what government is supposed to give to the poor.
Right.
So rather than just giving ways for poor people to stay poor and get by, if he's focusing on development, as Julia says, then that's supposed to be the trampoline to the working class or the middle class, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he and Newt Gingrich are totally aligned on these two
I don't think they're having meetings about this.
But, you know, going back to Julia's point a little bit too, he does come out of Chicago. You know, my understanding, talking to people like at Chicago's Metropolitan Planning Council, he's very much sort of in the Daley mold more than the LBJ mold, where it's about competition, it's about, you know, smart investments. A lot of the programs they've instituted, similar to Race for the Top, it's competition based. So it's you are getting a lot of people to make changes for less money because they'll make, you know, they will compete in those steps, you know.
So Race to the Top is an interesting example, where there's a federal pot of money, but it's not unlimited. Not every state can get it. The states have to compete against each other to get this education funding, and it's based on various reforms, right? How teachers are evaluated, how students are evaluated, things like that, that some people see as fairly conservative.
Right. It's the same thing at HUD. You know, there used to be a lot of block grants, and they still have a lot of those block grants done through formulas, but programs like Sustainable Communities took some of that money aside, and it's now targeted. You know, if you will come to us with programs that encourage smart growth, you know, discourage sprawl, transit-oriented development, green buildings, things of that nature, you know, we'll give you grants, you know, to help actualize these projects. Same thing with high-speed rail. You know, the Northeast Corridor, which arguably needs it more than any other, didn't get some of the big grants for that. You know, it's more about, I think, trying to encourage it in places that don't have it.
So is this approach working for New York? Is it working for other cities?
Well, it's very painful to say this, but I fear it's not working for New York or other cities. I think it's got the potential to work.
And what do we mean by working? What would we be seeing if these programs work better than old Democrat programs?
Well, first, we probably have to distinguish among cities. A city like New York is in a very different position from a city like Detroit, which Matt mentioned earlier. So the wealthy cities, New York, Chicago, Boston, LA, would really like to have a little bit of traditional federal pass-through funding, a little bit more community development, block grant money, for example, and they're not getting that, and that money could help them with their budgets, but the federal neglect on these programs is not going to hurt them. Some of these more distressed cities like Detroit, probably the lack of federal funding is hurting them. On the other hand, the president is probably right to think that these old categoricals like public housing did not help Detroit emerge from poverty and may well have helped its precipitate downward spiral.
So same question for you, Matt. If these things were working, what would we be seeing in New York, different from the past or different from the present?
I mean, it's an interesting question because I you know, as you suggest, I think maybe at least the headline of my article was a little unfair to the president. But, you know, still in talking to at least a dozen different planning experts, a lot of them struggled to point to a marquee program. And that's partly, you know, we're not building interstate highway systems anymore. The closest you might get is high-speed rail. And there's an example, too, where, you know, the president got defeated on a lot of these proposals by Republican governors, and there's only so much he could do about that. But, you know, I think partly it would just be, a stronger voice for cities. People were expecting that, and the high-speed rail, for example, was something that was mentioned a great deal during the State of the Union 2 years ago. And this year, it made almost no mentions. And WNYC, in fact, did a really great report on the Transportation Nation blog, looking at how the mentions of high-speed rail and infrastructure investments of that nature had gone down precipitously as 2011 wore on, and talking about road building and construction and sort of jobs. And that's one of the things he's really hamstrung by, is that the economy being what it is, he maybe can't dedicate as much attention to the cities as he does.
I don't want to ignore the possible factor of race in this conversation and in what the president does. Your article includes him not attending a ribbon cutting in Harlem for a federally funded housing program. You want to talk about that in particular and what you think the optics are or might have been?
Sure. I mean, that's a big challenge, I think, would be a challenge for any Democratic president to embrace these urban affairs issues. I mean, being the first black president, you still have programs that were put in place by white presidents as well, like food stamps, that have become basically punchlines, for some of the Republican presidential candidates. So black or white, cities are a difficult thing for Democrats. But I certainly think the fact of his race, creates an even greater challenge, because it gives this sense of, he's pandering to the old ways. And I was talking to someone at the Manhattan Institute, Fred Siegel, the Cooper Union professor, and he was saying that he actually was disappointed, because he thought the president, with his connections to a lot of these old interest groups, might have been able to break down some of the pass-throughs and things more than he has.
So what do you think, Julia, would change if the president is defeated? You don't have to compare Romney, Gingrich, Santorum, and Paul all to each other, but if there's a general thrust that the Republican Party has toward its own urban policies, I don't know, maybe the question is, how different is President Obama than what we had under 8 years of Bush? But what's at stake in the election in that respect?
Well, I think there are two things that are at stake in the election. One is the very important infrastructure issues that Matt's been touching on. And I think it's really quite horrifying in America that this set of questions around infrastructure, which should be non-ideological, has become so incredibly ideological. I think one of the best examples being the highway bill, right? I mean, the Times, Jennifer Steinauer had that piece a couple of days ago in the Times about the wall of opposition from both parties against the transportation bill. Now, if we can't agree on a highway bill with 20% public transit, I don't think we can agree on very much.
Is public transit the issue? I know that people around...
Everything's the issue, apparently.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
even
what's
the
so
highway
ludicrous.
spending itself?
Yeah.
I mean, well, they wanted to totally defund. They've since revised the bill and brought mass transit back in, because it was such a draconian bill. Ray LaHood, former Republican.
Who's the transportation
transportation
but also
secretary
Joe Lhota, the head of the MTA, who isn't given to making big pronouncements on federal policy, said this is a disaster.
And Michael Grimm, too, that
Republican congressman from Staten Island.
They were even opposition to this bill, because I believe by 2013 or 2014 it was going to totally phase out any federal funding for mass transit. But again, I think this gets to the issue of the Congress and particularly the Tea Party, just this idea that the federal government should be investing in nothing, and transportation, it's why we have eminent domain in the Constitution, right? I mean, this is the sort of foundational work that government was established to do, and it's really, it can't even do that anymore.
And it is just truly shocking to think we would have a country in which we apparently are just going to gallop away from public investment.
Right.
It happens, I just came back from Accra in Ghana, and I think one of the most shocking thing in African cities is the lack of public transportation. I mean, the colonial powers simply didn't put this in. And if we're not careful, we're going to go galloping in this direction of disinvestment, and the Republicans are leading the charge.
But there is another point of view out there, which I guess is roughly a Republican or more conservative point of view, which is that liberal Democrats want to tell Americans how to live, which is in dense clusters of housing around train stations in cities and inner suburbs. But Americans don't want to live that way. They want to live in houses with as much square footage as possible.
But that's the beauty of the
sprawled
old
out into the
transportation
country.
bill. That's the
Right.
beauty. I mean, I personally would have preferred that the old highway bill had 30 or 40% public transit, but okay, we've got the 20%, that's fine. 80% goes to dispersal and sprawl and...
And the thing too is with issues like $5 a gallon gas, I mean, there is a certain central planning role that the government's responsible for, and if whether or not people realize that, you know, there's a lot of questions about whether or not we can afford to keep living the way we can. And you know, I met with Adolfo Carrion his second to last week before leaving HUD, and he was saying, you know, that the average American spends something like 50% of their income on housing and transportation, you know, and so to not sort of nudge people, you know, it's like outlawing, you know, incandescent light bulbs, you know, is that telling you how to live, or is that saving everybody a couple bucks on their electricity bill?
All right, well, it's going to be interesting to see if the debate moderators even bring it up once we get to the general election. Will there be explicit conversation on the campaign trail about cities and urban policy in 2012? Obviously, sitting here in New York City, we hope so, regardless of what position you take on those issues. Thank you very much for joining us, both of you.
Thank you.
And coming up, climate change. Are we failing to take arms against a rising sea of troubles?
When you throw away money on wasted electricity, you're throwing away everything you could have bought with it. Saving energy saves you money. Learn more at energysavers.gov.
Well, I first started skating with my friend. He had an extra board, and then he just gave it to me, and I've been skating ever since. Well, when I don't land a trick and I have my mind set on something, and I'm not getting what I want, I just keep going for it until I get it right. My mom, she didn't go to college, so she wants me to experience that whole thing, and so I could end up getting like a good job. I think to get into college, I'll have to be determined, just like when I want to get a new trick, and skating's helped me realize I've got what it takes.
It's time now for another edition of Planet White House. This week, climate change and the presidency. Where do the Republican challengers stand? What's President Obama's record? What does the latest science actually tell us about what needs to be done to adapt to new weather and higher tides? And what's the timetable? To begin, a brief reminder of what some familiar politicians have been saying recently about global warming.
I assume all scientists would agree there are a variety of factors that cause the climate to change. I don't think any scientist in the world would suggest there isn't a variety of factors, and I think the vast majority of scientists say there's probably 100 factors that cause the climate to change. And so why have we decided that this one particular factor, carbon dioxide, is in fact the tip of the tail that wags the entire dog?
The statistics that show long term, hundreds if not thousands of years, we're not about, to melt.
My view is that we don't know what's causing climate change on this planet, and the idea of spending trillions and trillions of dollars to try and reduce CO2 emissions is not the right course for us.
I don't think we know. I think that the evidence is not complete, and I think that we're a long way from being able to translate a computer program into actual science.
All right, so you're an agnostic on the subject. Would that be accurate?
I think it'd be fair to say that I'm open-minded and certainly not prepared to spend trillions of dollars on a theory.
We see it in the stronger fires, the devastating floods, and the Pacific Islands confronting rising seas. And as countries with large carbon footprints, the United States and Australia have a special responsibility to lead.
Rick, Newt, Ron, Mitt, and Barack on climate change. Is politics distorting our understanding of climate change? Is New York moving at the right pace to prepare for high temperatures and higher tides? Joining us, a group of distinguished scientists, Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig with Columbia University's Earth Institute. She is a senior NASA researcher. William Solecki, professor at Hunter College, directs CUNY's Institute for Sustainable Cities. Together they co-chaired Mayor Bloomberg's panel on climate change. And with us via Skype from Ohio, Dr. David Orr. He is professor of environmental studies and politics at Oberlin College. His latest book, Down to the Wire, Confronting Climate Collapse. Hello to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Orr, I want to start with you. And we saw what seemed like a contrast between Republican positions, which were in a group, if not exactly of a piece, and then President Obama over here. But I want to read you a quote from Al Gore, who wrote that President Obama has, quote, never presented to the American people the magnitude of the climate crisis, not defended science against the ongoing withering and dishonest attacks. Too harsh when it comes to President Obama?
Well, I think President Obama is in a difficult situation. I think the outline of Vice President Gore's comments is correct. This is a huge crisis. The science is not entirely completed, but we know enough to act, and we know enough about the economics of acting that would suggest that this is entirely in our advantage to pursue first energy efficiency and deploy renewables with a sense of wartime urgency. And the failure to act, it will incur huge economic costs. So I think President Obama could have done a good bit more. So I think Vice President Gore's comments are essentially correct.
What would you like to have seen President Obama do in his first term?
Well, I think coming out of the starting blocks in January of 2009, I think the president should have announced to the public that this is not just another issue on a long list of issues, that this, in fact, is a linchpin that holds a number of issues together. And secondly, it's not an issue that gives us much leeway for action. At 392 parts per million carbon dioxide, we needed a president to use the White House, as Teddy Roosevelt called, a bully pulpit to help lead the public. And when the president has led on issues, I think he's pretty effective. But we did not have and do not have time to wait for a consensus to emerge among the Republican Party that does not seem to get the issue at all.
I'll bring our other guests in a minute. But if you're saying he should have made it a matter of central national priority and almost ethics like Lincoln did with slavery, something like that, I understand the urgency from where you stand, but President Obama came in with an absolute economic crisis on the nation's hands and a collapse in the job market, and he had to look at that first. And wouldn't short-term addressing global warming impose more economic hardship in the country?
No, it would not have. To the contrary, I think everything that he would have done or should have done, and in many ways has done, to promote energy efficiency and renewables would have supported economic recovery at a faster level. I think it would have been, in effect, maybe another 50% larger stimulus to the economy. The green part of the economy is the growing sector of the economy. There's employment, jobs, technology. There's every economic reason to pursue a green energy course exactly what you would do for prevent the worst of climate change.
Although, Dr. Rosenzweig, he did, when he launched the stimulus program at the beginning of his administration, have the greening of America as a central piece of that, right? So, in effect, he did try, to some degree at least, to combine fighting climate change and fighting joblessness.
Well, I think he did. I think that's right, and I think Martha Johnson at the General Services Administration and so forth, a number of people in the federal government, and because of the president's leadership, have instituted pretty effective federal buying programs and have done under the radar screen what could be done.
So let me jump to Dr. Rosenzweig and the greening of America, the infrastructure, et cetera.
Yes, in that program there was an emphasis on having energy and energy infrastructure and other infrastructure be more efficient. That's what we really need to do. We don't have to always call it climate change to be effective. So the administration has put forward executive orders to the agencies to improve energy efficiency, and to bring in the part that we work on, that Bill and I work on, to prepare for changing climate extremes. And so both on the mitigation side and on the adaptation side, there has been some progress.
And on the adaptation side, Dr. Solecki, we have the two of you working on a climate change panel for Mayor Bloomberg, and I guess that's where it falls in the city's lap, especially if the federal government and the governments of the world don't do enough to prevent climate change, then the deleterious effects have to be adapted to. Is that basically the city's job?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, the essence of cities have been to protect the residents within them. I mean, it goes back to the walls of Jericho. And so it is that sort of historical process of whoever are the leaders of those cities to be very interested in the welfare of the citizens, not only at the current moment, but looking into the future. And I think, Cynthia and I have written a lot about the idea of the first responders, that the cities, as you define, are places where we start to see some of these evidence of climate change, also connected with sort of ongoing issues of social tensions or economic tensions and so forth that are play out in cities, and they get exacerbated on the context of climate change. So this is sort of part of the challenge facing cities, not only just New York, but internationally.
And so, for example, more than a decade ago, climate researchers warned New Yorkers that within 30 years or so, seawalls might be needed around much of lower Manhattan and New Jersey, and runways at our airports should be raised above expected flood levels. Is that still the prediction?
Well, in fact, I mean, as I understand it, the Port Authority in 1988 were already raising and sort of understanding this as something to be concerned about. But the idea that sea level is a process that has been taking place for centuries, it is now accelerating with sea level rise. And what we've put forward to the mayor through the NPCC, New York City Panel on Climate Change, is that the environmental baseline of the city is starting to shift. And as a result, all of the codes, the standards, the regulations, all the things that we've developed in the 20th century to protect ourselves against climate risk have to be reevaluated. And it has to be done in a systematic fashion to sort of see which ones are the best to sort of approach first in order to provide the most amount of benefit.
Are we doing that?
That's the process that's underway. I mean, and again, it's sort of it's a laborious process. It sort of plays out in the agencies of the city. And as you know, it's not a totally seamless process. It move forward in some agencies more than others. But the process of sort of evaluating what the city can do is something that you see playing out across the city agencies.
You just came back from India,
yes.
I understand.
Yes.
What did you see there that's relevant to this discussion? And would you say in general that the rest of the world is ahead of us, behind us, parallel to us?
Well, what we see in cities all around the world, Brian, is that not only New York, but many cities around the world are emerging as first responders to climate change. As Bill was saying, cities are the front lines of climate extremes, and the mayors and the city governments are much closer to their citizens. So what happens when there's a climate disaster, let's say a coastal storm, such as Hurricane Katrina. What do the national leaders do? They helicopter in and they helicopter out. The mayors and the city leaders have to be there on the front lines figuring it out. And so what I saw in India is that the cities there are doing just that, undertaking adaptations, and other cities around the world as well.
Bangladesh, low-lying areas?
Oh, very much so. They've done a tremendous amount of work on sea level rise and the exacerbated coastal flooding that sea level rise brings. And they have there's some lessons that we've learned and that we can learn from cities around the world, such as social networking. In Bangladesh, there are wonderful social networks so that families in low-lying areas know families in higher areas that then they can go to. But that leads back to New York and what happened with Hurricane Irene when we had the first ever official evacuation ahead of a storm.
And they're on the cutting edge in the Netherlands, I understand.
Yes, they are.
They have the dikes against the sea that are famous, but also I hear things about floating houses and things like that.
Yes, so of course, much of the country of the Netherlands is under sea level, so below sea level. So it's an extreme case. We are low lying in many places, but we're not the way that the Dutch are. But what they had, the Dutch. It's a very interesting example because they had been dedicated to hard structures, to building seawalls and levees and barriers, up to protecting up to 5 meters. I mean, very, very high levels. But lately, they've been realizing that no country, even a small country like the Netherlands, could protect only through hard structures. So that's why they're now bringing in the potential for floating houses, they're actually tearing down levees so that then the coastal estuaries and the rivers near the coast could flood naturally and then recede.
So, Dr. Orr, let me come back to you and back to the politics. In fact, let me tick off the statements that we heard from a few of the Republican candidates for president. Mitt Romney said in that clip that he agrees that the Earth is warming, but, he says he's not sure how much is from human activity. So how much uncertainty would you as a scientist say that there really is about how much is from human activity?
I don't think there's any real disagreement among people who study climate for a living and have to live by the rigors of peer review, logic, fact, and data. I think the consensus is in the 95 to 98% range. There's some unknowns, but the big things are well known. And I think the largest factor in front of us is that we can adapt to some level of climatic destabilization, but we can't adapt to it beyond some point. And so mitigation, which will require national leadership and global leadership to begin the vast switch from fossil fuels to renewable fuels and energies and efficiency is absolutely essential.
But what does that mean? I'll bet the average American, even who's sympathetic to the idea that global warming is real and it's science, thinks maybe that's a little hyperbolic, that beyond a certain point we're not going to be able to adapt to it. So what if the temperature of the Earth went up on average 10 degrees? Then, maybe New York would be more like Georgia and Toronto would be more like New York. I don't know if those are exactly the right analogies. But yes, adaptation would need to take place. Why would it be such a catastrophe that you'd say we couldn't adapt to it?
Well, there are two big reasons. One is that it isn't just turning the thermostat up and nothing else wobbles. In fact, when you turn the thermostat of the Earth up, lots of other things come undone. So it means longer droughts, much bigger storms, rising sea levels, changing ecologies, changing disease patterns. A whole lot of things come undone that affect food supply and energy and social cohesion. So it isn't just a matter of turning your thermostat up in the house and maybe getting a slightly warmer temperature. And the other reason is, very simply, we know how fragile other cultures have been. Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, a few years ago, pointed out that when ecologies change and climate changes, most civilizations aren't well adapted or positioned to withstand that. And so what's coming down the road here isn't just a little bit warmer temperatures to which we probably could adapt. It's much more severe storms and longer droughts and bigger heat waves and rising sea levels. And if the science that we understand now is correct, this is a process we've set in motion for roughly another, let's call it 1,000 years of rising sea levels and rising temperatures. So this isn't a short-term crisis, and it's not fixable with a few adaptive measures. This is a long-term crisis that we've managed to incur. We hope that we can still head off the worst.
So again, back to the politics and back to the candidates. We heard Newt Gingrich in the clip of him say that I guess he basically told Bill O'Reilly that he's an agnostic on the science of global warming. But he's been trying to live down this 30-second spot that he made with former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. So let's roll this and see what Newt Gingrich was saying about global warming just a few years ago.
Hi, I'm Nancy Pelosi, lifelong Democrat and Speaker of the House.
And I'm Newt Gingrich, lifelong Republican, and I used to be Speaker.
We don't always see eye to eye, do we, Newt?
No, but we do agree our country must take action to address climate change.
We need cleaner forms of energy, and we need them fast.
If enough of us demand action from our leaders, we can spark the innovation we need.
Go to wecansolveit.org. Together, we can do this.
So, Dr. Orr, what was interesting to me there, besides the very fact of that spot's existence and that Gingrich said it's the worst mistake he's made in the last 5 years, that they said at the end that the role that they were trying to play was to help spark the innovation that we need. They didn't say carbon tax. They didn't say cap and trade. They didn't say green the infrastructure. They said spark the innovation, which to me means probably come up with the next great fuel that isn't carbon producing, that is also scalable to be used on a mass basis. What did you understand from that? And what were Gingrich and Pelosi ever actually trying to accomplish in addition to making that spot?
Well, I won't speak for them, but I think that Newt Gingrich's biggest failure wasn't in making the ad, it was disowning the ad afterwards. I think he was right when he made the ad. I think that was a pretty fair summary. The issue, I think, comes down to one of leadership. And you began this clip or this piece with mention of Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt, or you could mention even Winston Churchill. This has been a massive leadership failure. The first warning to a U.S. president about climate change was given in 1965 to Lyndon Johnson, and we still have no de jure climate or really very good energy policy. And so this is a massive leadership failure. And I think it is, Brian, it goes beyond, I think, simply technology adaptations, although those will be absolutely essential. I think it's a bigger issue than that. And it involves virtually every facet of American life. But I would start with federal policy that begins to incentivize the changes that we know we must make. And it turns out, ironically, that those are exactly the same kinds of changes we'd make if you were only concerned about economic health and the future of the economy.
I'll give you the last word. Dr. Rosenzweig, you want to say something? I want to hear what you think Mayor Bloomberg can accomplish in his last year.
Well, the cities are leading not only in adaptation, but they are leading in mitigation as well. For example, Mayor Bloomberg has led with a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in New York City by 30% by 2030, based on the 2005 level. So what we see from working with cities around the world is not, they are focused on adaptation, but not solely, because so much of the economic activity takes place in cities. And so they are simultaneously addressing both. So
but if this is a global problem, how much does it matter? Are we even almost fools in the city for having such an ambitious carbon-cutting program by 2030, if it means that we suffer for it, if they're building a new coal plant every 25 minutes in China?
By taking the lead, as David is asking for leadership, the mayors around the world. So for example, when we went to the Copenhagen, Bill and I were at the Copenhagen Climate Conference, and we were with the mayors. They were proactive, driving electric cars around Copenhagen and leading. And that leadership role can help to create a tipping point of response.
Dr. Solecki, same question, last word.
Well, just to go back to your previous segment as well, in terms of the urban issue and urban design, I mean, I think what this provides, and going back to the Gingrich and Pelosi quote, opportunity for innovation, to reimagine a city in which you can promote sustainability. And that, it's not only appropriate, ethical, all the other kinds of things, moral, but it also makes good business sense. I mean, in terms of economic savings. In terms of example, there's a lot of discussion about not only sort of energy recovery issues on normal distribution systems, but even our water, how we pipe our water around. And why do we have to pipe it to the top of a building? Why can't we pipe it, halfway and let it fall halfway instead of the 20th floor to the 10th floor? So these kinds of things, allow us to sort of reimagine what a city could be.
And this does exactly tie to the previous segment about whether the federal government should have a commitment to urban policy. But it ties back into the same skeptical question that I asked, which is, does any president have to put up with a lot of climate denial because Americans, for the most part, don't want to live clustered in cities around train stations or in inner suburbs. Many of them want to be able to sprawl out and have their bigger houses on more space.
Yeah. Majority live in suburbs, as you know. Yeah, it's a good question. But even in those contexts, I think those individuals recognize that they don't want to send as much money to their public utilities for their air conditioning, or put as much drive a car that is more efficient so they don't have to pay $4 a gallon as often.
And now they can't get mortgages anyway, so at least for the moment, it's a mood issue, but that's not going to persist for the rest of our lives. Thank you very much for an important conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next up, Dungeons & Dragons fans are helping to create the next version of the game.
When you earn your GED diploma, the barriers in your life fall. Earn your GED diploma and begin your brighter future. Traditional light bulbs actually generate 9 times more heat than light. Switch to Energy Star light bulbs, and you'll realize just how much cash you were really burning through. Saving energy saves you money. Learn more at energysavers.gov.
I look up to a lot of the older heads, the innovators, the heads of the art movements of the past. They kept it really edgy, and like a lot of the Latin American muralists and Latin American artists, and their styles were very unique and new to their time. Somewhat controversial, but that's who I look up to mainly. Personally, I'm very excited about going to college. It's something new and it's something different than what I'm used to. I'm definitely going to be a little out of my element, but that's what makes it so exciting, is that, it's something fresh. Well, there's so many opportunities that I think I could miss out on if I didn't go, Getting into college takes planning and vision. It's just like when I take a brick wall and turn it into a canvas for my art. Paintings help me realize that I've got what it takes.
The popular role-playing game, Dungeons & Dragons, is going through the 4th revision in its 38-year history. And the way the game will change won't be determined by a roll of the 8-sided die. Instead, Wizards of the Coast, the company that makes D&D, is reaching out to players and crowdsourcing the next version of the game. Here to take a look at the project and why D&D is still going strong in the age of World of Warcraft and things like that is the co-organizer of the New York City D&D Meetup, John Gephart, and Ken Breese, an active D&Der, also with us. And with us via Skype from Renton, Washington, is Mike Mearls, the lead developer of Dungeons & Dragons. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you so much.
John, assume for the moment no knowledge, but ultimate interest. For people who have never played, what's the object of the game?
If you could kind of consider it to be a board game. A board game mixed with collaborative storytelling. Takes place over the course of several hours. A lot of different players will meet maybe twice a month. I know a game that I'm in with Ken right now. We'll meet up, we'll have a couple of beers, have a couple snacks, and play for 4 or 5 hours. So he defines the story, we define the outcome, and everybody.
D&D really is a social, collaborative, imagination-driven narrative building. It is unlike any other game in that it takes not only a community, has a social aspect. It really provides for players a platform on which they can bring creations to life. It is creative experience like almost no other.
Mike, as lead developer, what does it mean that you actually do, and for how long have you been doing it?
So I've been working on role-playing games in general for about 12 years now. I've been working on D&D in specific for about the past 7 years. And really what we do here at Wizards, we're more the caretakers of the rules, making sure the rules will work appropriately within the sort of creative bounds of D&D, that when individual DMs and players are playing the game, everything works exactly the way it's supposed to, everything's smooth, easy to learn. We also do a lot of the work on the official D&D world settings, the different fantasy worlds that have been created for D&D over the years, and that have fans who maybe in place of creating their own worlds are using a published world, like the Forgotten Realms or the World of Greyhawk.
And why is the game evolving into its 4th edition? People who play conventional board games, I don't know, whatever they are, Monopoly, well, we didn't change the rules of Monopoly 4 times. Why is this the 4th evolution of Dungeons & Dragons?
I think in a lot of ways, since D&D engenders so much creativity, there's a lot more pressure on the rules to sort of keep up with how people are changing and the sort of different ways that fantasy has changed, and the different ways that just how people interact with games have changed. With online life becoming something more important now, having a lot more DMs talking across the world, where earlier it would have been just one DM and 4 or 5 players who maybe wouldn't even talk to anyone else who played D&D at all. I think what you'd see is more of a consensus of how the rules should change, and how we can create tools that are more effective at allowing players to express their individual creativity.
So John, where does the crowdsourcing come in?
Well, I know with our meetup, we have a core of probably 40 or 50 players at any given moment. Some people will play 4 times a week. Some people will get out once a month. And everybody has their opinion. You have certain types of people that enjoy the power gaming aspect, where they'll spend hours at home, just deciding which 4th level power is going to give them just a slight bit of an edge at a table. And some guys don't care at all. They want to show up. They want to, they want to do the interactive part. They want to improv their character's voice and their character's reasoning.
The crowdsourcing itself, I think, is working really great, and I think that Wizards is doing a really great thing in bringing it back to their fans and really listening to their fans. I think that the online polls have been exemplary. I also think that the just sort of willingness for the design teams to step out and ask for ideas is really engendering a lot of trust. Specifically, I think Monty Cook's articles are really, really great, and they should keep doing things just like that.
So, for example?
There are many different debates that go along with the rules of D&D, and the reason that we're in the 4th, re-envisioning of D&D, if you will, is we're trying to find a balance between a nostalgic D&D for some of those older players, I think, but those sorts of tropes and archetypes are shot through everything that comes out now. Just think of movies that are coming out recently or in the future, John Carter of Mars, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones on HBO. All of these cultural items are reflections of how deeply embedded those archetypes and tropes of D&D are in our pop culture now. You get a lot of players, new players, who come out of a World of Warcraft or come out of some other video game and find themselves wanting a bit more. And being able to bring those people into the conversation, as well as the old school gamers, those of us who have been playing the game since the 80s or even the late 70s, is so important in this next iteration of the game.
So Mike, what are you finding from the crowdsourcing that maybe surprises you, that you as a professional developer may not have thought of, might not even agree with, but are hearing from the actual players?
Yeah, I think the biggest surprise is it's easy to think that D&D, it's almost 40 years old, that there would be like a really huge generation gap between people who started when the game first showed up in the 70s and people who are playing now more recently. really what it comes down to is players, they like the freedom, they love the creativity, and they love the feeling that D&D is going to enable them, to create these realms and create these stories. So I've been really surprised by how often you'd expect a real clear divide between someone's interest in maybe the edition of the game they like the best or the style of game they want, and what they tell you what they want to see in the game. But we've already seen, we had at a game convention about 6 weeks ago now, we had a big test on site with surveys players filled out. And it was fairly interesting to see people who can consistently say they wanted a game where the rules got out of the way and allowed them to express, either they're creating a character or they wanted to be able to create a unique campaign or story. And it really wasn't so much the focus on the rules as the procedure behind the rules, but more the rules in terms of being able to enable that creativity. And so I was really surprised by how pronounced that was across the different gaming generations, if you will. That was a very consistent feeling we saw.
Since you have some dice here,
yes,
you want to show the viewers how you use them?
Sure. So the core mechanic in the game is a D20. It's a 20-sided die, if you like. So you'll usually be adding a modifier to that. You might have an armor class of 12. And so if I attack you with a sword that happens to add 16, and you roll this, you'll add that.
Let's see.
All right,
Is
so you
there
got a 10.
top of a 20-sided die? Yeah, there is.
So you got a 10. I said you had a 16 sword, and you got a, I think you got to beat like a 14 or something like that. Well, you would have hit. So, to really get into it, you would kind of describe. If it's a really strong hit, you would say, you kind of cleave the person nicely in the clavicle. If it's a weak hit, maybe they jumped it. Maybe it caught him in an ankle or something like that.
And there are also die with fewer sides.
Yes. So your sword might be a D8, depending on how it went that day for you. You would add 3 to that, and you'd roll this. And so, yeah, but that's simply the battle aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. And so, why do you think, with all the online innovation and other kinds of gaming, that D&D is still around 38 years later?
Well, really, the reason I think is that regardless of what an online experience can offer a user, it will always pale in comparison to a social face-to-face interaction. Even if you are doing D&D online, if you're gaming online, it's very, 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 I would say almost impossible to really replicate the experience one might have when being face-to-face. Again, I return to this idea that there are these tropes and narratives that are in our pop culture so deep that, it's people are excited by fantastical worlds, excited by the prospect of their imagination driving a narrative and driving their satisfaction or experience.
Mike, same question, because isn't there a lot of opportunity in other kinds of online games for people to use their imagination to drive things?
Yeah, and I think really what you see the big difference of D&D is it comes down to the dungeon master. That when you're playing a digital game, you have a lot of creativity, and it's increasingly so as a player, say, to create your avatar, what your character looks like, or how you want to play the game. There's a game called Skyrim that came out for the Xbox, PC. It lets you, just gives you this enormous world to explore. But the key thing for D&D is when you have the dungeon master, a person who is creating the story and creating the world as you go, it gives players an unmatched flexibility in how play proceeds and how things work. When you create a game, at the end of it, and you publish a digital game, the game is what it is. It contains everything that could possibly contain. But in a game of Dungeons and Dragons, there could be something that happens in the spur of the moment at a gaming table where the DM can just turn on a dime and decide this is now something has come up in the plot. I'm going to make this an important part of the story. Or I hadn't considered that the players might do this. They're going to head east and try to forge a treaty with the barbarians. And the DM, using the rules, can improvise that on the fly and create an adventure that may end up looking nothing like what the DM planned on.
I think Ken can attest to that. In the game that we play in, we're constantly challenging the boundaries. He'll come into a game, and I know he's got notes of what might happen over the course of a year, but any given game, I'll let him speak more to that. But
again, it really is an improv session in many ways. Yeah. So it is about a collaborative narrative building. It really is just as simple as that, though simple is probably not the best word to use. It is quite complex.
Right. And I'll jump back to Mike's other point, too, as far as the rules go and his survey results. I know at our tables, we have a couple guys in our game. I personally only came in, I've been playing for only a few years. We've got guys there who have been playing for, most of their life, and they know the rules, every single one. I might keep 70% of the rules in my mind at any given time, but if a rule doesn't really jive with the situation, we either as a table kind of overlook it, or we might let the DM, in this case Ken, for our game, just decide whether or not something happens. And everybody really pushes forward for the group's fun rather than being right.
Do you think that Dungeons & Dragons has influenced World of Warcraft, influenced some of the newer online games?
Oh, influenced, I would say that it's at the core. Yeah, I would say almost everything about those games is D&D based. From the weapons they use, to the stories, to the types of characters.
I think this focus on the rules that we're talking, that Mike brought up, that's in their sort of data that they're getting, is really important. From what I'm understanding, the next generation or iteration of D&D will be a modular sort of rule set, where players can take different modules of D&D and put them together to get a rule set that they're interested in. I think that's the exact way to go. And when we're starting to talk about modular learning and instructional design, we're talking about how do you teach someone something?
Yeah.
How do you teach someone the rules? How many rules should they be taught? What kind of rules do they want to be taught? I mean, we get into these very, very specific topics about how do people have fun? What is the best way to support them so they can continue to have fun? And I think it's important to remember that there are new players, and then there are players who've been playing D&D for many years, or used to play and don't play anymore, and their specific knowledge bases in terms of what they know about D&D, what they know about fantasy in general, what they want out of the experience. So to provide players with the tools to be able to build their experience in exactly the way they want, I think is gold.
So just tell our viewers, is the New York City D&D Meetup open to new members? And if so, how do they get in touch with you?
It always is. You can look on meetup.com. We're the NYC Dungeons & Dragons group. We have a fairly decent-sized meetup Tuesday nights. We also do every other Saturday, and I think the first Saturday of the month we play at Complete Strategist, which is a gaming store in the city.
And how can people contribute, Mike, to the crowdsourcing toward the next version of the game?
Yeah, if you go to dungeonsanddragons.com, we have a link there under the playtest tab that will give you info on how to contribute and how to sign up.
Thank you all very much. Have fun playing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's it for this week's show. We roll out a new episode Wednesday nights at 7:30, or see us anytime at CUNY.tv. Next week, nurturing the next generation of Silicon Valley coders. And check out my daily radio show weekday mornings at 10 on WNYC. Tomorrow morning, MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell. That's on 93.9 FM and AM 820 WNYC. Talk to you then.